Welcome to our deep dive into the dark origins of witchcraft, secrets you were never told. In today's exploration, we uncover forgotten histories, mysterious rituals, and ancient legends that have shaped the practices of witchcraft throughout centuries. Join us as we traverse shadowy realms of superstition and uncover astonishing secrets hidden in folklore and myth. Discover how misunderstood practices evolved into a powerful symbol of resistance against societal norms. Prepare for a thrilling journey into the enigmatic past, where history, magic, and myth intertwine to reveal an untold story of witchcraft's origin. Prepare yourself as ancient mysteries unravel before you. Ancient pagan roots of witchcraft. The roots of witchcraft can be traced back to pre-Christian pagan beliefs and practices. In ancient civilizations, magic was often seen as a natural force tied to the earth, the elements, and the cycles of life. Many early forms of witchcraft were connected to nature worship, with practitioners seeking to influence the forces of nature to ensure good harvests, healing, and protection. These early witches were often women, though men also practiced magic in various forms. They were healers, midwives, and seers, often regarded with a mixture of awe and suspicion. In many ancient societies, the distinction between religion and magic was blurry, and practices that we now classify as witchcraft were integrated into religious rituals. For instance, the ancient Greeks and Romans practiced forms of magic, such as the invocation of spirits or the use of herbs for healing, and many of these practices had a close relationship with the gods and goddesses they worshipped. The witches of these cultures often operated within an accepted framework of divine and natural forces. However, the perception of witchcraft began to shift over time. As Christianity spread throughout Europe, pagan traditions were increasingly demonized, and witchcraft came to be associated with heresy, evil, and a rejection of the Christian God. This shift marked the beginning of witchcraft's darker reputation in Western history. Christianity and the demonization of witchcraft. The transition from paganism to Christianity had a profound impact on the perception of witchcraft in Europe. As the Christian Church consolidated power during the Middle Ages, it began to regard pagan religious practices as immoral, ungodly, and often diabolical. The Christian doctrine of original sin, the concept of an omnipotent and singular God, and the fear of demonic influence all contributed to the vilification of witches. Witchcraft, in the Christian worldview, was seen as a direct challenge to the Church's authority and the divine order. The notion that humans could wield supernatural power outside of God's will was viewed as blasphemous. Those who practiced magic were seen as consorting with demons, violating religious commandments, and endangering their souls. Early Christian texts, including the Bible, offered strong condemnations of witchcraft. The Old Testament, in particular, prohibited the practice of magic and divination, e.g., Exodus 22 verse 18 and Deuteronomy 18 verses 10 to 12, which reinforced the idea that witchcraft was a threat to Christianity. During the medieval period, the Church worked to stamp out what it considered heretical practices. This effort gained momentum in the 15th and 16th centuries, especially during the rise of the European witch hunts. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued a papal bull, Summis Desiderans, which authorized the Inquisition to root out witches and heretics. This document set the stage for widespread witch trials across Europe. The witch hunts and persecutions. The most infamous period of witch trials and executions took place during the early modern period, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries. The witch hunts were driven by a combination of religious, social, and political factors. The Protestant Reformation, which splintered the Catholic Church and led to increased religious conflict, contributed to the rise of witch hysteria, as both Catholics and Protestants sought to purge heretical influences from their communities. The fear of witchcraft was further fueled by social and economic instability, including wars, plagues, and famines. In times of crisis, communities looked for scapegoats, and accusations of witchcraft provided a convenient explanation for misfortune. The perception that witches were in league with the devil and capable of causing harm through spells and curses became ingrained in European culture. In many cases, witchcraft accusations were rooted in misogyny. Women, particularly those who were poor, elderly, or otherwise marginalized, were often the targets of witch hunts. These women were seen as vulnerable to the temptation of evil and were frequently accused of practicing harmful magic, such as causing illness or death through witchcraft. The most notorious witch hunts occurred in regions such as Germany, France, England, and Scotland, where thousands of people, predominantly women, were executed. The Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by two Dominican monks, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, became the standard manual for identifying, prosecuting, and executing witches. It contained detailed instructions for recognizing witches, conducting trials, and using torture to extract confessions. The book cemented the link between witchcraft and Satanism and helped justify the brutal treatment of accused witches. It is estimated that tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were executed as a result of the witch hunts. The role of myth and folklore in witchcraft's dark image. Myths and folklore also played a significant role in shaping the dark image of witchcraft. Over time, witches became associated with various demonic and malevolent figures, including the devil himself. In folklore, witches were often depicted as using spells, potions, and rituals to bring about harm, such as cursing crops, causing livestock to die, or casting ill fortune upon individuals. These stories fed into the broader fear of witches, reinforcing the idea that witchcraft was a malevolent force. One of the most enduring myths associated with witchcraft is the idea that witches fly on broomsticks. This myth, rooted in ancient fertility rites and shamanistic practices, was linked to the belief that witches could communicate with spirits or travel between realms. It also contributed to the image of witches as both sexually promiscuous and evil, further reinforcing the notion that they were outside the bounds of conventional morality. Another common myth was the concept of the witches' Sabbath, a supposed gathering of witches to worship the devil. These secret gatherings were often depicted as wild, orgiastic rituals where witches would perform satanic rites and consort with demons. The idea of the Sabbath fed into the fear that witches were engaged in subversive, devil-worshipping behavior that posed a direct threat to society. While many of these myths were based on superstition and fear, they were used to justify the persecution and execution of people accused of witchcraft. The association between witches and dark, malevolent forces became deeply ingrained in European culture and continued to shape perceptions of witchcraft for centuries. Witchcraft in the modern era, from persecution to empowerment. While the witch hunts subsided in the 18th and 19th centuries, the stigma surrounding witchcraft persisted for many years. However, the 20th century saw a resurgence of interest in witchcraft, particularly as part of the broader occult and New Age movements. The feminist movement, in particular, embraced the figure of the witch as a symbol of female empowerment and rebellion against patriarchal oppression. Modern witchcraft, including Wicca, often focuses on nature worship, personal empowerment, and the healing arts, with little emphasis on the dark, sinister image that once dominated witchcraft's history. Despite this modern reclamation of witchcraft, the dark origins of the practice are still evident in the cultural memory of witchcraft. Myths about witches as dangerous, evil figures continue to appear in popular culture, from literature and films to television shows. The history of witchcraft remains a reminder of the dangers of superstition, religious intolerance, and societal scapegoating. Policy guidelines on disallowed content. When discussing sensitive topics such as witchcraft, it's important to acknowledge the policies that govern content creation and dissemination. The exploration of witchcraft's history, particularly its darker aspects, must be handled with care to avoid perpetuating harmful stereotypes, fearmongering, or promoting hate. Content that sensationalizes or glamorizes the persecution of witches, or that spreads misinformation about modern practitioners, can contribute to harmful narratives. Similarly, content that trivializes or misrepresents the experiences of those who were persecuted during the witch hunts can be hurtful and inappropriate. Content creators and educators should aim to present a balanced view of witchcraft's history, acknowledging the complex interplay of religious, social, and political forces that shape the practice while being mindful of the harm caused by historical persecution. It's also crucial to distinguish between historical witchcraft and modern practices, which vary greatly and are often focused on positive aspects such as personal growth, environmental awareness, and spirituality. The dark origins of witchcraft are rooted in a complex history of religious conflict, social fear, and political manipulation. From its pagan roots as a form of nature worship to its demonization by the Christian Church, witchcraft has been cast in a negative light for centuries. The witch hunts of the early modern period were fueled by myths, superstition, and a desire to control marginalized individuals, particularly women. While modern witchcraft has evolved into a more positive and empowering practice, the dark history of witchcraft remains an important part of its legacy. Understanding this history is crucial for acknowledging the ways in which superstition and fear can lead to injustice and persecution. It is a reminder that history is often shaped by those in power and that marginalized communities, including those accused of witchcraft, have been subjected to violence and oppression throughout the ages. The modern revival of witchcraft can serve as both a reclaiming of lost traditions and a powerful symbol of resistance to societal forces that seek to control and silence individuals. Witchcraft in pre-modern societies, pagan and folk traditions. The origins of witchcraft can be traced back to pre-modern societies where animism and polytheism were common. Early human societies saw the world as a place filled with spirits, deities, and forces that could be tapped into or influenced. Ancient religions often involved rituals, prayers, and sacrifices that aimed to harness these forces. Witchcraft, in this early stage, was often linked to the idea of magic, both for healing and for harm. Paganism, in its broadest sense, is a term used to describe the polytheistic and nature-centered religious practices that flourished in Europe before the rise of Christianity. These practices were deeply rooted in the cycles of nature, including the changing of seasons, agricultural cycles, and celestial phenomena. Deities and spirits were believed to inhabit natural objects, from trees to rivers, to animals and the elements. Witchcraft, in this context, was not seen as evil but rather as a form of wisdom. A witch in pre-modern societies could be seen as a shaman or healer, someone with knowledge of the natural world and the ability to influence it. Folk traditions also played a significant role in the development of witchcraft. In many rural communities, practical magic was a way to ensure survival and security. Folk magic, sometimes known as cunning folk magic, was utilized to protect against illness, bring good harvests, ensure safe travel, and ward off evil spirits. These practices were often passed down through generations, typically from older women, and involved rituals, charms, and the use of herbs. The understanding of the natural world, the medicinal and magical properties of plants, stones, and other elements, formed the backbone of these traditions. 2. The rise of Christianity and the demonization of witchcraft. With the rise of Christianity, especially in Europe, came a significant shift in the perception of witchcraft. Early Christian doctrine rejected pagan beliefs, and many ancient practices were condemned as heretical or devil-worshipping. Witchcraft became associated with the devil, particularly during the Middle Ages. This association was especially strong after the Christianization of Europe, which saw the emergence of the witch hunts. The Church became a key force in identifying and persecuting witches. In the 15th and 16th centuries, European monarchies and religious authorities began to prosecute suspected witches, leading to widespread witch hunts. These hunts were based on the belief that witches made pacts with the devil, engaged in harmful magic, and undermined the Christian faith. The witch hunts were especially intense in regions like Germany, France, and Britain, with thousands of people, mostly women, being accused, tortured, and executed. The peak of the European witch craze occurred during the 16th and 17th centuries, with figures such as the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of Witches, a 1487 book that provided guidelines for identifying and prosecuting witches. It is estimated that over 40,000 people were executed in the witch hunts, though some scholars argue the number could be much higher. 3. African traditions, witchcraft and spiritual practices. While European witchcraft evolved within a Christian framework, Africa also has a rich and diverse history of spiritual practices that include witchcraft. African witchcraft is not a monolithic belief system but varies greatly between regions and cultures. Many African communities have long held that there is a spiritual world that interacts with the physical world, and witchcraft, in this context, is a way of navigating and manipulating these forces. Witchcraft in many African traditions is seen as both positive and negative, with the power to heal and to harm. It is often associated with ancestral spirits, divination, and the use of spiritual power for personal gain or community protection. Some African communities see witchcraft as a social function, a way of maintaining harmony within the group. Those believed to possess magical power are often sought after as healers, diviners, or advisors. In many African traditions, there are different types of magic, such as protective magic, fertility rituals, and healing practices. For example, in West Africa, The Yoruba people practice a form of witchcraft rooted in their religious system known as Ifa, which is based on divination and the veneration of ancestral spirits. In Central Africa, practices like the use of medicinal herbs, spiritual cleansing rituals, and ancestral worship are common. In Southern Africa, witchcraft has historically been associated with both negative forces and the use of magic for protection or good fortune. 4. African witchcraft and the transatlantic slave trade. The history of African witchcraft took on a new dimension with the transatlantic slave trade. Many enslaved Africans brought their spiritual practices with them to the Americas, where they would influence the development of new forms of witchcraft in the New World. In the Caribbean, Brazil, and other parts of the Americas, African diasporic traditions blended with indigenous and European influences to form unique spiritual practices. In particular, the religion of Vodou or Voodoo emerged in Haiti, combining African traditions with elements of Catholicism. Vodou incorporates a variety of African beliefs, including ancestor worship, spirit possession, and the use of ritual magic. This syncretic form of spiritual practice became associated with witchcraft in the eyes of colonial authorities, who saw it as a threat to their control over enslaved populations. Similarly, in Brazil, the Afro-Brazilian religion of Candomblé evolved from African spiritual practices, again blending African beliefs with Catholic elements. In the United States, African American witchcraft traditions also arose from the blending of African, Native American, and European influences. Practices like hoodoo and conjure became associated with African American folk magic, including the use of herbs, charms, and ritual to bring about change, protect against harm, and ensure success. These traditions have persisted in various forms and continue to be practiced today in African American communities. 5. The evolution of witchcraft in the modern era. In the modern era, the perception of witchcraft has undergone significant changes. The decline of traditional religious authority, coupled with the rise of individualism, led to a more diverse and decentralized understanding of witchcraft. In the 19th and 20th centuries, interest in witchcraft experienced a resurgence, especially with the rise of the occult and Neopagan movements. The modern Wicca movement, founded by figures like Gerald Gardner and Doreen Valiente in the mid-20th century, was a key development in the evolution of witchcraft. Wicca, which draws heavily on pre-Christian European pagan traditions, is one of the most well-known modern forms of witchcraft. Wiccans believe in the importance of nature, the worship of the goddess and god, and the practice of magic for positive purposes. The Wiccan Rede, which advises and it harm none, do what ye will, reflects a moral code that emphasizes personal responsibility and the ethical use of magical power. Wicca and other modern pagan movements, such as Druidry and Heat Henry, have gained followers around the world and are recognized as legitimate religious practices in many countries. These contemporary forms of witchcraft often emphasize personal empowerment, spiritual connection with nature, and the pursuit of knowledge. In addition to Wicca, the late 20th and early 21st centuries have seen the rise of eclectic witchcraft, which blends elements from various traditions, including European, African, and Native American practices. This approach allows practitioners to pick and choose rituals, deities, and magical techniques that resonate with their personal beliefs. 6. Witchcraft in popular culture and contemporary society. In modern times, witchcraft has become a powerful symbol in popular culture. Movies, books, and TV shows, from The Wizard of Oz to Harry Potter to Charmed, have shaped public perceptions of witches, often portraying them as powerful women capable of great magic. These representations, while often fantastical, have contributed to a broader interest in witchcraft and its practices. The rise of social media and online communities has also allowed modern witches and practitioners of occult traditions to connect with one another and share their knowledge. Platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube have fostered a vibrant community of witches who share spells, rituals, and spiritual practices. Despite these modern adaptations, witchcraft in many forms continues to be a means of spiritual expression, empowerment, and healing. It is practiced in various ways around the world, with a diverse set of beliefs and practices reflecting the rich cultural, historical, and spiritual traditions from which it originated. Witchcraft has a long and varied history, one that intersects with diverse religious, social, and cultural movements across the globe. From its roots in pre-modern pagan and folk traditions to its demonization during the rise of Christianity and its evolution in African and diasporic spiritual systems, Witchcraft is a reflection of humanity's need to understand, influence, and coexist with a natural and spiritual world. The resurgence of witchcraft in the modern era highlights its enduring appeal and the desire for personal empowerment and connection with ancient wisdom. As we look to the future, witchcraft will likely continue to evolve, reflecting the changing values, practices, and concerns of society. Early pre-Christian witchcraft. The earliest traces of witchcraft are found in the spiritual practices of ancient cultures, where magic was often viewed as a natural and intrinsic part of the world. Many pre-Christian societies, such as those of ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Greece, practiced forms of magic and sorcery that would later be categorized as witchcraft. In ancient Mesopotamia, for instance, the Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians had complex pantheons and rituals dedicated to gods and spirits, and magic played a key role in religious life. Magical practices were believed to be powerful tools to connect with deities, manipulate fate, or control the natural world. There were divine and human practitioners of magic, and witches or sorcerers were often viewed as either gifted or cursed, capable of great power or equally dangerous misfortune. In Egypt, witchcraft was intertwined with the worship of gods like Isis, who was revered as a goddess of magic, healing, and protection. Many magical texts, such as the Pyramid texts, the Coffin texts, and the Book of the Dead, reveal that the ancient Egyptians practiced rituals to summon and appease deities, as well as spells for health, protection, and ensuring a safe passage to the afterlife. Witches or magicians in this context were often seen as specialists with a unique relationship with the divine, wielding power that could influence both the physical and spiritual realms. The ancient Greeks and Romans, too, had rich traditions of magic and sorcery. Figures such as Circe, Medea, and Hecate emerged as iconic representations of witches in Greek mythology. Hecate, the goddess of witchcraft, magic, the moon, and necromancy, was often depicted as a figure who could manipulate the unseen forces of the world. She represented the powerful, mysterious, and sometimes dangerous side of witchcraft, which was seen as both a force for healing and for destruction. In these ancient civilizations, witchcraft was not viewed in the same negative light that it would later adopt in the Christian era. Magic and witchcraft were often seen as tools for survival, protection, and communication with the divine, rather than inherently evil practices. Nature and the goddess, the role of the earth in pre-Christian witchcraft. The idea of a powerful connection between witches and nature was central to pre-Christian traditions. In many ancient societies, the forces of nature, earth, water, air, and fire, were believed to hold immense spiritual and magical significance. Magic was often a means of interacting with these forces, to harness their energy for healing, protection, or divination. For example, in ancient Celtic traditions, the Druids were known to be spiritual leaders and keepers of knowledge, practicing forms of magic that drew heavily on the cycles of the moon, the seasons, and natural phenomena. The concept of the goddess in pre-Christian cultures was another key component of witchcraft. Many of the earliest pagan religions were polytheistic and had goddess figures that represented the forces of fertility, creation, and life. In cultures such as the Celts, the Germanic tribes, and the Norse, goddess worship was central. These figures, such as Brigid, Freya, and the Triple Goddess, were revered as powerful, nurturing, and protective forces who personified the earth and its natural cycles. The role of the witch in these cultures was often one of connection to these divine feminine figures and the natural world. Witches were believed to have an inherent understanding of the mysteries of life, death, and rebirth, which were reflected in the agricultural cycles and the changing seasons. The ancient connection between witchcraft and nature set the foundation for many of the beliefs that would continue to influence witchcraft throughout history, including the later concepts of the Wiccan Rede, which emphasizes harm none and the cyclical nature of life. Witchcraft's evolution through medieval Europe. As we move into the medieval period, witchcraft in Europe began to evolve in response to the shifting political, social, and religious landscapes. The rise of Christianity brought about a dramatic transformation in the way witchcraft was perceived. What was once a spiritual practice connected to the earth and the divine feminine began to be viewed through a Christian lens, which often depicted witchcraft as a form of heresy and evil. The Christianization of Europe and witchcraft. By the time Christianity spread across Europe in the early centuries of the Common Era, many of the ancient pagan practices, including witchcraft, were absorbed into the Christian worldview, but often with a darker connotation. Early Christians condemned pagan practices, associating them with devil worship, idolatry, and sin. As Christian authorities gained more power, they began to suppress these practices, labeling them as dangerous and heretical. The witch hunts of medieval Europe, which reached their peak between the 15th and 18th centuries, were part of this larger context. Witchcraft was viewed not simply as a form of magic, but as an evil force that threatened the social, religious, and moral order. The Church, in particular, saw witches as people who had made pacts with the devil, and they were often accused of causing harm through malevolent spells, curses, and rituals. One of the most significant developments in the medieval witchcraft narrative was the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. This treatise, which was used to justify the persecution of witches, described witches as heretics who conspired with the devil. It introduced a new, dangerous narrative of witchcraft, one that depicted witches as malevolent beings who posed a threat to both the spiritual and physical world. The witch hunts and Inquisition. The witch hunts of medieval Europe were deeply influenced by this growing fear of witchcraft as a demonic force. Thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft, tortured, and executed during this period. The Inquisition, which sought to root out heresy and enforce religious orthodoxy, played a key role in the persecution of witches. The witch hunts were particularly intense in areas like Germany, France, and England, where religious authorities collaborated with secular governments to suppress alleged witchcraft. During these times, magical practices that had once been accepted or even revered were now criminalized. Women who practiced herbal medicine, midwifery, or folk healing were often accused of witchcraft, as were those who lived outside the norms of their communities. In many cases, accusations of witchcraft were based on superstition, personal grievances, or local power struggles. In contrast to earlier pagan traditions, which viewed witches as figures of wisdom and power, the medieval period associated witchcraft with the forces of darkness, evil, and chaos. This shift marked a dramatic departure from the earlier, more benign forms of magic practiced by the ancient civilizations. Magical influences from various cultures. Despite the persecution and demonization of witchcraft in medieval Europe, elements of magical traditions from other cultures continued to influence European witchcraft practices, especially during the Renaissance and beyond. These influences came from both the Islamic world and the Far East, where magic and the occult had a long-standing history. Islamic magical traditions. During the medieval period, contact between the Islamic world and Christian Europe facilitated the exchange of magical knowledge. Islamic scholars, particularly in cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, were instrumental in preserving ancient Greek and Roman texts on magic, astrology, and alchemy. These texts, which had been largely lost to Europe during the early Middle Ages, were rediscovered and translated into Latin. Many of these texts were rich in occult and magical knowledge, and they influenced the development of magical practices in medieval Europe. Islamic magical traditions, including the use of talismans, amulets, and charms, found their way into European witchcraft. These practices were often seen as both practical and spiritual, providing protection, healing, and the power to influence the world in positive or negative ways. Eastern and African magical practices. Eastern and African magical traditions also contributed to the evolving practice of witchcraft in Europe. The influx of ideas from Asia, particularly through trade routes and cultural exchanges, introduced Europeans to practices such as geomancy, divination through the earth, astrology, and the use of specific herbs and rituals to invoke supernatural forces. African traditions, especially those related to spirit work, ancestor veneration, and healing, influenced the practices of witchcraft among enslaved Africans in the Americas. These influences gave rise to syncretic practices like voodoo in Haiti, candomblé in Brazil, and Santeria in Cuba, which blended African traditions with elements of Catholicism and European folk magic. These traditions, although developed outside of Europe, showed the adaptability and resilience of magical practices in the face of religious oppression. Witchcraft's evolution through ancient, medieval, and beyond has been shaped by various cultural, social, and religious forces. From its ancient roots in the practices of early civilizations, to its evolution through the Christianization of Europe and the rise of witch hunts, witchcraft has undergone significant transformations. Its practices, however, have remained deeply connected to nature, spirituality, and the human desire to influence the world through magical means. The pre-Christian traditions of witchcraft, with their emphasis on nature, the goddess, and the interconnectedness of all things, laid the groundwork for later magical practices, even as witchcraft became demonized in the medieval period. Despite centuries of persecution, the practices of witchcraft evolved and endured, adapting to the changing times and blending with influences from other cultures. In modern times, witchcraft continues to thrive, particularly in contemporary pagan and neo-pagan movements, where the ancient traditions of witchcraft are revived and celebrated. Understanding the rich and complex history of witchcraft not only gives us insight into the magical practices of the past but also illuminates the ways in which societies have grappled with the unknown and the supernatural throughout history. The ambivalence of magic. In early societies, magic was a fundamental part of life, interwoven with religious practices, everyday healing, and the protection of the community. However, it was also recognized as a force that could be turned to malevolent purposes. The perception of magic was thus highly ambivalent. It was a tool that could be wielded for both benevolent and harmful ends. This ambivalence is one of the defining features of magical practices, especially in pre-modern cultures, where the lines between the sacred and the profane, the good and the bad, were often fluid and negotiable. This dual nature of magic is evident in many ancient cultures, including those of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and Rome, as well as in various indigenous traditions. In these societies, the same magical forces that could be invoked for healing or prosperity could also be used to curse or bring about misfortune. The same rituals, spells, or symbols that were meant to protect a person or community could just as easily be used to harm them if misused. Magic for healing and protection. In many early cultures, magic was primarily seen as a means of ensuring health, prosperity, and protection. Healers, shamans, and priests were often called upon to perform rituals that could heal physical ailments, ward off evil spirits, or ensure good fortune. These forms of magic were generally viewed as beneficial and were closely linked with religious practices and the protection of the community. In ancient Egypt, for example, magical practices were deeply intertwined with religion and medicine. Priests and healers would use incantations, amulets, and protective rituals to cure diseases, ensure fertility, and offer divine protection. Similarly, the ancient Greeks believed in the power of the gods and the use of herbs, incantations, and charms to promote health and well-being. Healing deities such as Asclepius were invoked in the hopes of curing ailments, and the practice of healing magic was considered a divine gift. In other cultures, such as those of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, magic played a significant role in ensuring the fertility of the land and the success of crops. Shamans performed rituals to invoke rain, fertility, and the favor of the gods. Such rituals were often conducted with great care and reverence, and their intended outcomes were almost always positive: health, prosperity, and the continued survival of the community. Protection was another vital aspect of positive magical practices. Amulets, talismans, and charms were commonly used in ancient cultures to ward off evil spirits, curses, and misfortune. These objects, imbued with magical power, were believed to create a shield of protection around the wearer. In many cultures, protection magic was also used in the context of warfare, where soldiers or warriors would use charms or rituals to shield themselves from harm or ensure victory in battle. Magic for curses and retribution. While magic was often used for healing and protection, it also had a darker side. Magic could be turned against individuals, communities, or even entire nations, invoking curses, vengeance, and misfortune. This darker side of magic is perhaps best understood within the context of the concept of revenge or retribution. Magic was often used as a tool of vengeance, where an individual or group would invoke supernatural forces to punish an enemy or seek justice. In ancient Mesopotamia, for instance, there are numerous examples of curses invoked by kings or individuals to ensure that their enemies would suffer misfortune. Curses were seen as powerful tools for enforcing justice and punishing those who wronged the practitioner. The same magical practices that could protect a person or city could also be used to bring harm to a rival or enemy. The ancient Greeks also had a tradition of using magic for retribution. One of the most famous examples is the use of the curse tablets or depictions. These were small lead tablets inscribed with curses, which were often used to call upon the gods or spirits to exact revenge on an individual. These curses could be used to cause harm, such as illness, financial ruin, or even death, to the targeted person. These practices were not necessarily seen as immoral, rather, they were considered legitimate methods of dealing with personal grievances and seeking justice in a world where formal legal systems were not always accessible or effective. Similarly, in medieval Europe, the practice of witchcraft and the use of magic for vengeance were often linked. Accusations of witchcraft were frequently motivated by personal vendettas or the desire for retribution. A person who was wronged or suffered a loss might accuse someone of practicing harmful magic to explain their misfortune, and in some cases, individuals were believed to have the ability to curse others through supernatural means. The role of intention and outcome. The dual nature of magic, its potential for both healing and harm, was often understood in terms of the intentions of the practitioner and the outcomes of their actions. Moral judgment about magic was not based solely on the magical acts themselves, but rather on the purpose behind those acts and the results they produced. In many cultures, magic was seen as a neutral force that could be used for both good and evil. It was the intention of the magician that determined whether the outcome was seen as positive or negative. A healer performing magic to cure a disease or protect a community was typically viewed as virtuous, while a magician who used their power to cause harm or seek revenge was seen as malevolent. Thus, magical practices were judged not by the nature of the magic itself, but by the morality of the practitioner's intentions. This principle is evident in the distinction between white and black magic in European folklore. White magic, associated with healing and protection, was considered benevolent and was often practiced by wise women, shamans, or healers. Black magic, on the other hand, was associated with curses, malevolent intent, and the invocation of dark forces. The boundary between the two was often porous, and practitioners of magic might shift between the two categories depending on the context and the outcomes of their work. In some cultures, the intention behind magical acts was thought to be directly linked to the moral alignment of the practitioner. In ancient Egypt, for instance, magical acts were often performed in accordance with Ma'at, the concept of cosmic order and truth. Magic that aligned with Ma'at, promoting harmony, justice, and well-being, was considered righteous, while magic that violated Ma'at and caused disorder was seen as evil. Similarly, in other cultures, magic that supported the well-being of individuals and communities was viewed positively, while magic used for personal gain or to harm others was seen as a violation of social or divine laws. The fear of misuse. Despite the potential benefits of magic, there was also a deep fear surrounding its misuse. Magic was often seen as a dangerous force that could easily spiral out of control if not properly regulated. The fear of misuse was particularly pronounced when it came to magic used for malevolent purposes. This fear was amplified by the belief that magic could be used to manipulate or control others, particularly through the invocation of spirits or deities. In many societies, there were strict codes or laws governing the practice of magic. For example, in ancient Israel, the practice of sorcery and witchcraft was strictly prohibited by religious law, as it was believed to be a form of idolatry and an attempt to control the divine. Similarly, in medieval Europe, witch hunts and trials were conducted to root out those who were believed to be misusing magic for harmful purposes. The fear of the misuse of magic was not just a concern for the individual, but for the larger community, which could be at risk from the repercussions of magical acts. The dual nature of magic, as both a force for healing and protection and a tool for curses and retribution, has been a constant theme throughout history. Early societies recognized the potential for magic to be used for both benevolent and malevolent ends, and moral judgments about magic were often based on the intentions of the practitioner and the outcomes of their actions. In these early contexts, magic was seen as neither inherently good nor evil, but rather as a neutral force whose value depended on the circumstances surrounding its use. The complexity and ambiguity surrounding magic continue to be reflected in modern interpretations, where magic is still understood as a potent force capable of both healing and harm, depending on the motives and actions of those who wield it. Thank you for joining us on this mysterious journey into the dark origins of witchcraft. We hope these hidden secrets and ancient rituals have sparked your curiosity and ignited a desire to explore the forgotten chapters of history. If you found this video intriguing, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and share with fellow seekers of the unknown. Your thoughts and theories are welcome in the comments below as we continue to uncover more enigmatic truths. Until our next adventure, remain curious, question everything, and embrace the shadows of the past. Thank you for watching and see you soon.